"I'll take her," he said, and the sound didn't rise above a calm voice, but it carried across the entire street like a church bell on a quiet Sunday morning. And just like that, every boot stopped moving, every coin stopped clinking, every man turned his head at once, as if something invisible had reached out and held them still, because out here in the dry heat of a West Texas noon, under a sun that bleached color from wood and skin alike, a sentence like that didn't belong, not in a place where people measured worth in cattle, land, and silence, and certainly not when it came to a woman standing bound at the center of it all, her wrists tied with rough rope, her posture straight despite the dust clinging to her dress, her dark eyes steady in a way that made men uncomfortable without knowing why. And Ethan Cole stood there on the edge of the crowd, hat pulled low, coat worn for miles that had no map, looking like a man who had drifted too far into a place that didn't want him. Except he wasn't drifting. Not today. Today he had stepped forward, and that was the part no one understood, because Ethan was known, not by name, but by absence, the kind of man who kept to himself, worked where the land needed him, left before sunrise, spoke only when the moment demanded it, and never, not once, had anyone seen him interfere with the affairs of a town that had long ago decided it didn't owe him a place. And yet there he was, cutting through the tension with a choice that no one had offered him, not the sheriff standing stiff near the wooden post, not the ranchers with folded arms and narrowed eyes, not the traders who had started this whole thing with numbers and nods, because to them, the woman wasn't a person, not in the way they counted people. She was a problem carried in from the hills, an Apache woman found near territory lines no one agreed on, a question no one wanted to answer. And the easiest way to solve a question like that was to turn it into a transaction, something simple, something final, something that ended before it began. But Ethan had stepped into the middle of that simplicity and broken it with 6 quiet words, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, thick as the dust in the air, because nobody knew what came after a sentence like that. Not here, not in a town that had built its peace on keeping certain lines from ever being crossed. And the sheriff cleared his throat like a man trying to remind the world how things were supposed to work, his hand resting near his belt not out of threat, but out of habit, the way men held on to rules when the ground beneath them started to shift. "You know what you're saying, Cole?" he asked, voice low, measured, like he was offering a way out that didn't involve consequences. But Ethan didn't look at him. Not yet. His gaze stayed fixed on the woman, Nayeli, though he didn't know her name, not officially, not in a way that had ever been spoken aloud in his presence. But there was something in the way she stood, something in the way she didn't lower her eyes, didn't shrink, didn't play the role the town had already written for her, that made him understand more than names ever could. And for a brief second, just a flicker of time, something passed between them, not trust, not even agreement, just recognition, the kind that doesn't ask permission, the kind that doesn't explain itself. And it unsettled him in a way he hadn't felt in years, because recognition like that comes from places people try to forget, and Ethan had spent a long time forgetting. Long miles, long winters, long stretches of sky that offered nothing but distance. And yet here it was again, standing 10 feet away, tied to a post in the middle of a town that believed it knew exactly what it was looking at, and still saw nothing. And the murmurs started then, low at first, men shifting, voices rising just enough to remind each other that this wasn't normal, that something had gone off script, because a cowboy didn't step forward like this, didn't claim something that wasn't his to claim, didn't challenge the quiet agreements that kept everything in place. And yet Ethan remained where he was, not reaching for anything, not raising his voice, just standing with that same stillness that had carried him across miles most men wouldn't survive. And when he finally spoke again, it wasn't louder, it wasn't sharper, it was the same steady tone, the same certainty. "I know exactly what I'm saying." And that was when the air changed, subtle but real, like the moment before a storm decides whether it's going to pass or settle in, and the sheriff's jaw tightened, not out of anger, but out of something closer to concern, because men like Ethan didn't make moves like this without reason. And reasons out here had a way of unraveling things people worked. Voices rising, decisions made, hands moving. But now everything hung in place, waiting for someone to decide what came after a choice no one had prepared for. And the sheriff shifted his weight, boots grinding softly against the dry earth, eyes moving from Ethan to the woman and back again like he was measuring distance that could not be measured in feet or yards. "You are stepping into something that does not belong to you," he said, not loud, not angry, just certain, the way a man speaks when he believes the world has rules that hold. But Ethan finally looked at him then, slow, steady, not challenging, not backing down, just present. And there was something in that look that made the sheriff pause for half a breath longer than he intended, because it was not defiance, it was not ignorance, it was something quieter, something that said the decision had already been made long before this moment. And the crowd felt it too, even if they could not name it. A shift, small but undeniable, like the first drop of rain on dust. And behind the sheriff, one of the ranchers stepped forward, hat tilted back, voice carrying the edge of a man who did not like uncertainty. "You planning to walk her out of here like she is yours?" he asked, and a few others chuckled, not because it was funny, but because laughter was easier than silence, easier than admitting they did not know what to do. And Ethan did not answer right away. His gaze drifted back to the woman, to the rope around her wrists, to the way her shoulders stayed square despite everything around her. And he took one step forward, just one, slow enough that every man could see it, and the sound of his boot against the ground felt louder than it should have, like a signal no one had agreed to. And that was when Naeli moved for the first time in a way that changed the air. Not a struggle, not resistance, just a slight turn of her head, her eyes narrowing just enough to study him more closely, as if she was trying to place something she could not quite reach. And Ethan felt it again, that recognition, deeper now, closer, like a memory pressing against the inside of his chest, and it unsettled him in a way he did not show, because out here, men did not show things like that, not in front of a crowd that would take anything and turn it into weakness. And yet he did not stop, did not hesitate. He stepped closer until he stood within arm's reach of her, the rope between them now the only thing left of the distance the town had built. And the sheriff's voice came again, sharper this time. "That is far enough." But it landed softer than it should have, because even he could feel that stopping this would require more than words. And Ethan lifted his hand, not toward his belt, not toward any weapon, just toward the rope, fingers brushing the rough fibers like he was testing something older than the moment itself. And the crowd leaned in without meaning to, every man holding his breath just a little tighter, because this was the line. This was where a choice became something real, something that could not be taken back. And before his fingers closed around the knot, Naeli spoke, her voice low, steady, carrying a weight that did not match her situation. "Do you understand what you are doing?" she asked, her English careful, shaped by a rhythm different from the one around them. And it was not fear in her voice, not gratitude either. It was a question, direct and unguarded, and it struck Ethan harder than anything else in that moment, because no one else had asked him that, not the sheriff, not the men, not even himself. And he paused, just long enough for the silence to notice, long enough for the wind to slip between them and carry the faint scent of leather and sun-warmed wood. And when he answered, it was quiet, but it did not waver. "Enough," he said, and something in that single word settled deeper than explanation ever could. And Naeli held his gaze for another second, searching, measuring, and then something shifted in her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but the edge of resistance softened just enough to make room for possibility. And that was all the permission Ethan needed, because he pulled the knot loose then, slow, deliberate, the rope falling away from her wrists with a soft, dry whisper that sounded louder than any shout in that moment. And the town felt it, felt the line break, felt the rules bend in a way they had not in years, and no one moved. Not right away, because they were all waiting to see what would follow, waiting for the part where things snapped back into place, where someone stepped in, where something corrected the imbalance. But nothing did. The rope lay on the ground between them, dust settling over it like it had always been there. And Naeli lowered her hands slowly, rubbing her wrists once, not out of pain, but out of habit, her posture never breaking, never shrinking. And when she looked at Ethan again, it was different now, still cautious, still distant, but no longer distant in the same way. And behind them, the murmurs returned, louder this time, sharper, men stepping forward, uncertainty turning into something harder, something that wanted to reclaim control. And the sheriff exhaled through his nose, long and measured, as if he was deciding whether to let this continue or to end it before it moved beyond his reach. And Ethan could feel it all, the weight of every eye, every expectation, every unspoken rule pressing in. But he did not look away, not from her, not from what he had already set in motion, because somewhere deep inside, beneath the dust and the years and the silence he had built around himself, something old had already chosen this path, and now it was too late to turn back. The rope lay in the dust like something forgotten, but no one forgot it. Not really, because every man standing there knew that what had just happened could not be undone, not by words, not by the quiet rules that had held this town together for years, and the tension did not break. It shifted, turning slower, heavier, like a wheel that had been forced off its track, and the first step came from behind, boots moving, gravel crunching, a man stepping closer than he should have. His voice rough with the kind of certainty that comes from never being questioned. "You cannot just walk her out," he said. And it was not a threat. Not yet. It was something more dangerous, something like expectation, like the world correcting itself, and Ethan did not turn to him, did not give him the moment he wanted. Because his focus stayed where it had been since the beginning, on Naeli, who now stood free but not released, because freedom given by one man in a place like this did not mean safety. Not yet, not until the space around her changed, and she understood that faster than anyone else there. Her shoulders still held tight, her eyes still scanning, measuring distances, counting men, calculating paths that did not exist. And when she finally spoke again, it was quieter than before, meant for him. "Alone. They will not let this end simply," she said, and Ethan gave the smallest nod, not agreement, not reassurance, just acknowledgement, because he already knew, had known the moment he stepped forward, that this would not end at the rope, and the sheriff took a step closer then, his voice firmer now, pulled back into the shape of authority. "Cole, you made your point," he said. "Now step away and let us handle what is ours to handle." And there it was, the line drawn again, ownership, wrapped in language, in law, in habit, and for a moment, the air held still, waiting to see if Ethan would accept it, if he would step back, if he would let the town fold this moment back into something familiar. But he did not move, not away, not forward, just stood, steady as the fence posts lining the edge of the street. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried just enough to reach beyond the two of them. "She is not yours to handle," he said, and that sentence landed differently then. The first, not like a disruption, but like a refusal, and the crowd reacted to that, voices rising sharper now, men shifting closer together, uncertainty hardening into something that wanted resolution, because people could live with confusion for only so long before they needed it to become something they could act on. And Naeli felt it as clearly as he did, the tightening circle, the narrowing space. The way eyes changed when a situation moved from strange to unacceptable, and she took a step, small, controlled, placing herself just slightly behind Ethan's shoulder, not hiding, not yielding, but aligning, and it was a subtle thing, so small that many did not notice, but those who did felt it in their chest, because it changed the shape of what they were looking at, no longer a man and a captive, but two figures standing in the same direction, and that unsettled them more than anything else so far, because it suggested something they had not prepared for, something that did not fit into the categories they understood, and the sheriff saw it too, his jaw tightening again, not out of anger, but out of the realization that control was slipping, not dramatically, not loudly, but steadily, like water finding a path through stone. And he tried once more, his voice lower now, meant to pull Ethan back without breaking the moment entirely. "You walk away now, and this can still end clean," he said, and Ethan almost smiled, not with humor, not with defiance, just with the faintest trace of something that understood how late that offer had come, because clean endings did not belong to choices like this, not out here, not when lines had already been crossed. And he shook his head once, slow, final, and the wind picked up again, carrying dust between them, soft against skin, whispering across boots and wood and rope left behind. And for a brief second, everything felt suspended, like the land itself was holding its breath. And then Naeli spoke again, not to him this time, not quietly, but clearly enough for those closest to hear, her voice steady, shaped by something older than the town. "You do not understand what you are choosing," she said, and there was no accusation in it, no warning either, just truth. And Ethan turned his head slightly, enough to catch her voice, enough to answer without looking directly at her. Maybe not, he said. But I know what I am not choosing. And that answer settled between them in a way words rarely did, because it was not about her alone, not about the town, not even about the moment. It was about something deeper, something that had been building long before this day. And Naeli felt that too, her gaze lingering on him a fraction longer, searching for something she could not name, something that felt familiar in a way that did not make sense. And behind them, the crowd shifted again, a man calling out for order, another for reason. Voices overlapping, pushing toward a breaking point that had not yet come but could be felt in every breath. And the sheriff lifted his hand, not to command, but to steady, to hold the moment together long enough to decide what came next, because he understood, perhaps better than anyone else there, that whatever happened in the next few seconds would not stay contained within this street, would not fade with the dust when it settled. It would carry, across ranches and valleys, across stories, told by firelight, shaping how people saw each other long after this day was gone. And Ethan stood in the center of it, unmoving, the weight of that future pressing against him without sound, without warning, and still he did not step back, because somewhere deep inside, the choice had already been made, and now it was no longer his alone to carry. No one spoke for a moment after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because every word now felt like it would tip something fragile into motion, and the town had begun to understand that this was no longer a simple matter they could settle with noise and numbers. And the sheriff lowered his hand slowly, the gesture less command than hesitation, his eyes scanning the faces around him as if searching for someone willing to take responsibility for what came next. But no one stepped forward, not yet, because even the loudest voices sensed that something deeper had taken hold of the moment, something that could not be pushed aside without consequence. And the wind shifted again, carrying a dry heat across the street, brushing against Ethan's coat and lifting a strand of Naeli's dark hair across her cheek. And she did not move to fix it, did not break her stance, her gaze steady now not only on him but on the space beyond, as if she was listening to something that others could not hear. And Ethan noticed it, the way her focus drifted past the crowd, past the buildings, toward the open land beyond the town's edge, and it stirred something in him, something old, something he had buried beneath years of silence and distance, because that look did not belong to fear or defiance. It belonged to awareness, the kind that came from knowing the land, from reading it like a map that changed with every step. And for a brief second, he felt out of place in a way he had not since he was younger, before the miles, before the solitude, before he learned to stand alone without questioning it. And then one of the men near the front stepped forward again, his voice sharper now, stripped of patience. "You think you can just take her and walk out of here?" he said. And the question was no longer rhetorical. It demanded an answer, demanded a return to something solid, something the town could agree on. And Ethan finally turned his head fully toward him, not fast, not reactive, just deliberate. And the movement alone quieted a few of the voices still rising behind him, because there was no uncertainty in it, no hesitation, just a calm that felt heavier than anger. And he answered simply, "Yes." And that single word landed harder than any argument could have, because it left no room for negotiation, no space to reshape the moment into something easier to accept. And the man's mouth tightened, his weight shifting forward as if preparing to close the distance. But he stopped short, not because of Ethan, not entirely, but because something in the air had changed again, something that made instinct pause before action. And the sheriff felt it too, his gaze flicking toward the edge of town for just a second longer than necessary. And Ethan caught that glance, subtle but clear, and followed it without turning his head, only shifting his focus, letting his eyes move just enough to take in the horizon beyond the last row of buildings. And there it was, faint at first, almost nothing, just a line of dust rising where the land met the sky, too distant to name, too steady to ignore. And his chest tightened, not with fear, not with anticipation, but with recognition, the same quiet certainty that had followed him into this moment from the beginning. And Naeli saw it at the same time, her posture changing in a way that was almost invisible, her shoulders easing not into comfort, but into readiness, and she stepped half a pace closer to him, not behind him this time, but beside him, aligning fully, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, but it carried a different weight now. "You are not the only one who made a choice today," she said, and Ethan understood that without asking, because whatever was coming was not drawn by him alone, not pulled into this town by his decision. It had its own path, its own reason, and the town felt it before they saw it, the shift in attention, the way heads turned in uneven sequence, the murmurs breaking apart and reforming into something quieter, something uncertain, and the man who had spoken before glanced over his shoulder, his expression tightening as he noticed the same distant line of dust, and the sheriff exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but heavy with realization, because this was the part no one had planned for, the part that did not belong to the town, did not answer to its rules or its timing, and Ethan remained still, not reaching, not preparing in any visible way, just standing there with the same calm that had carried him through the last few minutes. And for the first time since he spoke those words, something like doubt brushed the edge of his thoughts, not about the choice itself, but about its weight, about what it meant now that it was no longer contained within this street. And Nayeli turned her head slightly, her eyes moving toward the horizon fully now, and there was something in her expression that had not been there before, not fear, not relief, something closer to acceptance, as if she had been waiting for this moment in a way he had not understood. And she spoke once more, not to the crowd, not to the sheriff, but to him alone, her voice low enough that it did not carry beyond the space between them. "When they arrive, you must not speak first," she said, and the words settled into him with a weight that did not need explanation, because he could feel it, the difference between what had been happening here and what was about to begin, and the town, now fully aware that something was coming, fell into a silence deeper than before, not forced, not held, but natural, the kind that comes when people realize they are no longer in control of the story unfolding around them, and the dust on the horizon grew just a little thicker, just enough that it could no longer be ignored, and Ethan Cole stood in the center of it all, between a town that did not understand him and a horizon that did, knowing that whatever came next would not ask for permission, and that for the first time in a long while, he would not be the one choosing how it began. The dust did not rush in. It grew, slow and deliberate, like something that understood time better than the people watching it, and that made it worse, because a fast approach could be dismissed, explained away, but this steady line on the horizon carried intention, and the town felt it settle into their bones, turning unease into something quieter, something heavier, and one by one, the voices faded, not because anyone commanded silence, but because silence had become the only thing that made sense. And the sheriff took another step forward, closer to Ethan and Nayeli now, not to separate them, not yet, but to stand nearer to the center of what was unfolding, his eyes fixed on that distant rise of dust, his hand no longer resting near his belt, but hanging loose at his side, as if he understood that whatever was coming would not be answered with the habits he had relied on for years. And Ethan did not move, his posture unchanged, but inside, something tightened, not fear, not hesitation, just awareness sharpening into something that demanded attention, because he could feel the weight of the moment shifting again, pulling away from the town, from the men, from the rope that still lay at his feet, towards something older, something that did not belong to any one place. And beside him, Nayeli breathed in slowly, the rise and fall of her chest steady, controlled, as if she had done this before, as if standing on the edge of something unknown was not unfamiliar to her. And when she spoke again, it was barely above a whisper. "Do not mistake their silence for weakness," she said, her eyes never leaving the horizon. And Ethan gave the smallest nod, because he understood that kind of silence, had lived inside it for years, the kind that did not need to announce itself to be felt. And behind them, one of the men shifted his stance, boots scraping louder than they should have in the stillness. "Could be nothing," he muttered, but the words carried no conviction, falling flat against the truth that everyone could already see. And another man answered, quieter, "Nothing does not move like that." And the exchange died there, because neither of them wanted to follow that thought to its end. And the sheriff finally spoke again, not to Ethan this time, but to the town. His voice low, steady, trying to gather what control remained. "Everyone stay where you are," he said, and for once, they listened without argument, not out of obedience, but because no one wanted to be the one who moved first. Not now. Not with that line of dust growing thicker by the second, and Ethan shifted his weight just slightly, enough to feel the ground beneath his boots, solid, real, grounding him in a moment that felt like it was beginning to slip beyond anything he could hold. And he glanced at Naeli, just for a second, and saw something there he had not seen before. Not caution, not distance, but something like calm, not the absence of danger, but the acceptance of it. And it unsettled him in a way he could not explain, because it suggested that what was coming was not a surprise to her, not entirely. And that realization settled into him with a quiet weight, and the dust rose higher now, no longer a faint line but a shape, defined enough that the eye could follow it, and the first outlines of riders began to form. Within it, distant figures moving in unison, not rushed, not scattered, but deliberate, and the town reacted without meaning to. A ripple of movement passing through the crowd as men adjusted their stance, as if preparing for something they could not yet name, and the sheriff straightened slightly, his shoulders pulling back into the posture of a man who had worn authority long enough to rely on it even when it faltered. And he took one more step forward, placing himself just ahead of Ethan and Naeli, not as a barrier, but as a presence, as if he still believed he could stand between the town and whatever approached. And Ethan noticed that, the instinct behind it, the attempt to hold the line even, as it shifted beneath his feet, and he did not interfere, did not move to stand beside or ahead of him, because something in Naeli's words held him still, something about not speaking first, about letting what came arrive on its own terms. And the riders grew clearer with every passing second, shapes becoming forms, forms becoming people, their movement steady across the open land, their line unbroken, and the town watched, breath held collectively, because there was no mistaking it now, no room left for denial. And Naeli took a single step forward, not past Ethan, not toward the sheriff, just enough to stand fully in the open, her chin lifting slightly, her posture aligning with something unseen but deeply rooted. And Ethan felt the shift in her, the way she changed not outwardly, but inwardly, stepping into a role that did not need to be announced. And for the first time since this began, he understood that this was not about taking her away, not in the way the town had thought, not even in the way he had first believed. This was about standing where she stood, about choosing not to turn away when the moment demanded it. And the riders slowed as they neared the edge of town, their pace easing not out of hesitation, but out of intention, as if they respected the boundary even as they approached it. And the dust began to settle around them, revealing more clearly who they were. And the sheriff's breath caught just slightly, not enough for others to notice, but enough for Ethan to see, because he was watching closely now, watching everything. And the space between what had been and what was coming narrowed to something almost tangible, and the entire town stood suspended within it, waiting for the moment when silence would finally give way to whatever came next. The riders did not stop at the edge of town, but they did not rush in either, their horses slowing to a measured walk as if every step had already been decided long before they were seen. And the dust settled around them in soft waves, revealing faces that did not carry anger, did not carry haste, only presence. And that was what made the town uneasy, because men knew how to answer anger, they knew how to respond to threats. But this calm, this quiet certainty, left no place to push back. And the sheriff stood straighter, drawing a breath that seemed heavier than the air itself, his voice ready but not yet spoken, waiting for the moment to form clearly. And Ethan felt the shift as the riders came closer, close enough now that details emerged, the worn leather of saddles, the patterns worked into cloth, the steady eyes that scanned the street without breaking stride. And beside him, Naeli did not move forward again, did not retreat. She simply stood where she was, rooted in a way that made the ground beneath her seem more certain than anything else around them. And when the lead rider finally slowed to a stop a few yards from the sheriff, the entire town seemed to lean inward without taking a single step, and no one spoke, not at first, because the silence now belonged to the riders, not to the town. And Ethan remembered her words, "Do not speak first," and he held to them, even as The instinct to fill the quiet pressed against him, and the lead rider looked across the faces, not hurried, not searching, just seeing. And then his gaze settled on Nayeli, and something passed there, something that did not need words, recognition, not new, not surprising, but expected. And Nayeli inclined her head just slightly, not a bow, not submission, but acknowledgement, and the rider returned it with the same restraint. And the sheriff cleared his throat then, unable to hold the silence any longer. "You have come into this town without word," he said, his voice steady but careful. "State your purpose." And the rider turned his gaze to him, not dismissive, not confrontational, just present. And when he spoke, his voice carried calm weight, measured like the movement that brought him here. "We come for what was taken," he said, and the words settled over the street like dust returning to the ground. And the sheriff's brow tightened. "Nothing here was taken," he replied, but even as he spoke, his certainty felt thinner, because the meaning of the rider's words did not sit within the rules he knew. And the rider did not argue, did not press. He simply shifted his gaze back to Nayeli, and that alone answered more than any exchange could have. And the town felt it, the realization passing from one man to another, quiet, undeniable, and Ethan stood still within it, feeling the weight of where he stood now, between two worlds that did not speak the same language, did not share the same rules, and yet somehow met in this single moment. And Nayeli stepped forward then, just one step, closing the small distance between herself and the space that separated the town from the riders. And her voice came, clear, steady, not raised, but carrying through the silence with ease. "Nothing was taken," she said, echoing the sheriff, but not in agreement, in correction, and she paused just long enough for the meaning to settle before continuing. "I came," and that changed everything, because it shifted the ground beneath the words, turned the situation from something done to her into something chosen. And the town felt it slip from their grasp, the shape of the story no longer theirs to define. And the rider nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging a truth already known, and Ethan felt something in his chest ease, not relief, not fully, but a recognition that this moment was unfolding on terms he did not control and did not need to. And the sheriff hesitated then, caught between the version of events he could enforce and the one now standing before him. And in that hesitation, the balance shifted again, away from authority, towards something quieter, something that did not demand but simply existed. And Nayeli turned her head slightly toward Ethan, not fully, just enough for him to see the change in her eyes. And there was no longer caution there, not in the same way, but something steadier, something that acknowledged his presence not as interference, but as part of what had brought this moment into being. And Ethan understood then, not everything, not the full weight of what he had stepped into, but enough to know that his role was not to lead, not to claim, but to stand, to remain. And he did, as the wind moved softly through the street, carrying the last of the dust away, leaving the town exposed in a way it had not been before. And no one reached for anything, no one raised a voice, because something deeper had settled over them, something that did not allow for the old reactions. And the rider spoke again, quieter now. "Then we have come to witness," he said, and the word lingered, unfamiliar in this place, because it asked nothing, demanded nothing, only presence. And the town did not know what to do with that, because they had expected a demand, a claim, something they could answer, and instead they were given something else entirely. And Ethan stood there between them, feeling the shift settle into the ground beneath his boots, knowing that whatever came next would not be decided by force or argument, but by something far more difficult to face, the truth of what had just happened, and what it meant for all of them. The word witness did not settle easily among the people standing there. It did not carry weight they understood, and that made it heavier than any demand could have been, because a demand could be answered, refused, negotiated, but witnessing meant something else entirely. It meant standing still long enough to see what had already happened, and the town was not used to that, not used to being seen. And the sheriff felt it press against him like heat, the slow realization that control had slipped not in a single moment, but in a series of quiet choices he had allowed to pass. And he looked from the rider to Nayeli, and then to Ethan, trying to find a place to stand that still made sense, but none of it aligned the way it had before. and Ethan did not move, did not speak, because he understood now that anything he said would pull the moment back into something smaller, something easier for the town to grasp. And that was not what this was anymore. And beside him, Naeli drew in a breath that was steady and unhurried. And when she exhaled, it seemed to carry something with it, not tension, but decision, and she stepped forward again, one pace closer to the rider, closing the distance in a way that no one in the town would have dared, and her voice came again, calm, clear, shaped by something older than the wooden buildings and the dust beneath their boots. "You came to see if I was taken," she said, not asking, not accusing, just stating what had been assumed, and the rider nodded once, slow, measured. "We came to see if you were held," he answered, and the difference between those words moved through the crowd like a quiet wind, because held meant something the town could not easily deny. And Naeli let that hang for a moment, long enough for every man there to feel it settle into his chest, and then she turned slightly, not fully, just enough that her voice would carry, beyond the riders, beyond Ethan, into the space where the town stood listening. "I was not held," she said, and the simplicity of it made it harder, not easier, because there was no argument to meet it, no accusation to defend against, just a truth that stood on its own. And the sheriff shifted again, his mouth parting as if to speak, but no words came, because what could he say that would not unravel further under the weight of what had already been seen? And Ethan watched her, really watched her now, the way she held herself, the way her words did not rush, did not push, but still reached every ear, and he realized that what she was doing was not for him, not even for herself alone. It was for the moment, for the space that had opened when he cut that rope, and for the first time, he understood that his choice had not ended anything. It had begun something, something that now stood fully in her hands. And she turned her head just slightly toward him then, her eyes meeting his for a brief second, and there was something there that had not been there before, not distance, not caution, but a quiet acknowledgement, as if she recognized the place he had taken without asking. And then she looked back to the rider, and her next words carried differently, softer, but deeper. "I chose to stand here," she said, and the rider's gaze did not waver, but something in it shifted, not surprise, not doubt, something closer to respect, and he inclined his head again, a gesture that held meaning beyond the town's understanding, and behind him, the other riders remained still, their presence steady, not pressing forward, not retreating, simply there. And that steadiness began to affect the crowd in a way they could not resist. Voices that had once been ready to rise now stayed quiet. Hands that might have gestured or pointed remained at their sides, because there was nothing to push against, nothing to resist, only something to accept or deny. And denial required more certainty than anyone there now possessed. And the sheriff finally lowered his gaze for a brief moment, not in defeat, not fully, but in recognition, because he could feel the weight of the moment settling into a place beyond his reach, beyond his authority. And when he looked up again, his voice was different, not commanding, not defensive, just measured. "Then what happens now?" he asked. And it was the first honest question anyone had spoken since the riders arrived, because it admitted what had become clear to everyone, that the answer no longer belonged to the town alone. And Naeli did not answer right away. She let the silence hold the question, let it settle into the ground beneath them. And Ethan felt that too, the patience in it, the refusal to rush what needed to be seen clearly. And the wind moved again, softer now, carrying away the last traces of dust so that the space between the town and the riders stood clear and open. And in that openness, something shifted, not outwardly, but within, the understanding that what came next would not be decided by force or by law, but by the choices each of them made in this moment. And Naeli finally spoke, her voice steady, certain, now. "You remember," she said, and the words landed quietly, but they carried farther than anything else that had been spoken, because they did not ask for action, they asked for recognition, and the town felt it, the weight of memory pressing against them, not of this moment alone, but of others, of choices made and lines drawn, of things taken and things assumed. And Ethan stood in the center of it, feeling the shift settle into something real, something that would not fade when the riders turned away, something that would remain long after the dust had settled. And he realized then that the moment he had stepped forward, the moment he had spoken those 6 words, had not been about changing the town or saving a stranger. It had been about standing still long enough for something true to be seen. And now that it had been seen, there was no turning away from it. Not for him, not for Naeli, and not for the town that had witnessed it. The words did not fade when she spoke them. They stayed, hanging in the open air like something carved into wood. Now you remember, and the town did not know where to place them, because memory was not something they could measure or trade. It was not something they could push aside with louder voices or firmer rules, and that made it heavier than anything that had come before. And the sheriff stood there with his shoulders no longer squared in command, but held in something quieter, something closer to reflection, his gaze drifting across the faces of the men behind him as if searching for confirmation that he had not imagined the shift that had taken hold. But he found none, because each man stood alone now inside his own thoughts, and Ethan felt it too. The way the moment had turned inward, the way it no longer demanded action but demanded something harder, understanding, and beside him Naeli remained still, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that no longer felt out of place but central, as if the ground itself had adjusted to her standing there. And the lead rider watched her for a long second, not pressing, not urging, simply waiting, and that waiting carried respect in it, a kind of patience that did not exist in the town before this moment. And Ethan noticed that, the difference between waiting to act and waiting to understand, and it settled into him slowly, like a lesson he had not realized he needed. And one of the men in the crowd shifted again, his voice lower now, uncertain in a way that had not been there before. "What is there to remember?" he said. But the question did not challenge, it revealed, because it showed the gap between what had been seen and what had been accepted. And Naeli turned her head slightly toward him, her eyes meeting his not with judgment, not with anger, but with something steadier. "You remember the lines you draw," she said. And her voice carried just enough to reach him, "and those closest, and the ones you pretend are not there." And the words moved through the crowd quietly, not striking like a blow, but settling like dust, because every man there knew the lines she spoke of, even if they had never named them. And Ethan felt something in his chest tighten again, not from the town this time, but from within, because her words reached him too, reaching back through years he had spent walking away from places like this, from choices like this, and he realized that what he had done today had not been separate from those years, it had been shaped by them. By every moment he had chosen silence over involvement, distance over connection, and now that distance had closed, and there was no returning to it, and the sheriff took a slow breath, his eyes settling on Naeli again. And when he spoke, his voice carried something new, not authority, not uncertainty, but an attempt at clarity. "And what do you remember?" he asked, and it was not a challenge, it was a question that reached beyond the town, beyond the moment. And Naeli did not answer right away. She let the silence hold the question again, let it deepen, and then she spoke, softer now, but no less clear. "I remember who I am when I stand here," she said. And the simplicity of it made it harder to dismiss, because it did not rely on the town, did not rely on the riders, it stood on its own. And the lead rider inclined his head once more, not in agreement, not in approval, but in acknowledgement of something that did not require either. And Ethan felt that too, the weight of identity settling into the space between them, not as something to be proven, but something already known. And he realized that this moment had never been about deciding what Naeli was. It had been about whether the town would see it, and whether he would stand long enough to let them. And the crowd shifted again, not forward, not back, but inward, each man adjusting to the weight of what had been said. And no one reached for anything, no one raised a voice, because the need for that had passed, replaced by something quieter, something that did not allow for easy escape. And the sheriff finally lowered his head. Slightly, not enough to be called a bow, but enough to show that something in him had changed. And when he looked up again, his voice was softer, stripped of the force it had carried before. "Then there is nothing to hold," he said, and the words felt different in his mouth, as if he was speaking them for the first time. And Naeli nodded once, a small movement, but it carried finality, because it closed the space that had been held open since the beginning. And the lead rider turned his head slightly toward the others behind him, a gesture so subtle it could have been missed, But it was enough, because the line of riders shifted as one, not in retreat, not in advance, but in readiness, as if the purpose that had brought them here had been fulfilled without a single command being given. And Ethan watched it all with a stillness that matched theirs, understanding now that this was the resolution, not marked by a single act, not defined by a clear ending, but by a change that could not be undone. And as the wind moved once more through the street, carrying away the last traces of dust and tension, the town stood quieter than it had ever been, not because it had been silenced, but because it had been shown something it could not ignore. And Ethan Cole remained where he was, no longer at the edge, no longer outside, but fully within the moment he had chosen, knowing that whatever came after would not erase what had been seen, and that was something no one there could take back. The riders did not leave immediately, and that was the part that lingered longer than anything else, because departure would have marked an ending, a clean line the town could follow back into its old shape. But instead they remained, still as fence posts under a high noon sun, their presence quiet but undeniable, and the town felt it, that unfinished edge, that sense that something more was being asked without words. And Ethan stood where he had been, the dust settled around his boots, the rope still lying behind him like a memory no one could pick up again. And beside him Naeli did not shift, did not step away, her gaze no longer fixed on the riders alone, but moving across the town slowly, deliberately, as if she was seeing each face for what it truly held, not the surface, not the role, but the quiet truths people carried when they believed no one was looking. And one by one, men lowered their eyes, not out of shame they could name, but out of something they could not quite hold on to, something that slipped through their fingers the moment they tried to grasp it. And the sheriff noticed that too. The way the crowd no longer stood as one, but as individuals, each man separate now, no longer shielded by the noise of the group. And he drew in a breath that felt heavier than the last, his voice quieter when he spoke again. "Is there more?" he asked, not to challenge, not to command, but to understand if the moment required anything further from him. And the lead rider looked at him, then at Naeli, and for the first time, his gaze shifted toward Ethan, not sharply, not with suspicion, but with curiosity, as if acknowledging a piece of the story that had not yet been spoken. And Ethan felt that look settle on him, felt the weight of being seen from a place beyond the town, beyond the expectations he had learned to navigate, and it stirred something deeper, something older than the miles he had traveled. And for a brief second, memory rose uninvited, a younger version of himself standing on unfamiliar ground, unsure of the rules, unsure of where he belonged. And he pushed it down, not out of fear, but because this moment was not about the past, it was about what stood in front of him now. And Naeli followed the rider's gaze, turning toward Ethan fully for the first time since the riders arrived. And there was no distance in her eyes now, no guarded edge, only a quiet question that did not need to be spoken aloud. And Ethan understood it without words, because it mirrored something in him, something that had been forming since the moment he stepped forward. And the silence held again, not empty, but full. And then Naeli spoke, her voice steady, carrying across the space between them and the riders. "There is one more thing," she said, and the town felt that. The shift, the realization that the moment had not yet closed. And the sheriff straightened slightly, not in resistance, but in readiness. And the lead rider inclined his head just enough to show that he was listening. And Naeli took a slow breath, her gaze still on Ethan. And when she spoke again, her words moved carefully, deliberately, as if each one mattered more than the last. "He stepped forward when no one else did," she said, and the simplicity of it carried farther than any explanation could have, because it stripped the moment down to its core, to a single action that could not be argued away. And the town felt it land, felt it settle into the spaces they had tried to avoid. And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not discomfort, not pride, but something quieter, something that did not belong to him alone. And Naeli turned her gaze back to the rider, continuing without pause. "He did not ask what it would cost him," she said, and the rider's expression did not change. But something in his stillness deepened, and the men behind him remained silent, their attention fixed, unbroken. And the sheriff looked at Ethan then, really looked at him, as if seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a stranger on the edge of town, but as a man who had stepped into something larger than himself without hesitation, and that recognition shifted something inside him, something he had not expected to confront, and the crowd felt it too. The quiet reevaluation of a man they had barely noticed before today, and Nayeli's voice softened slightly as she finished. "That matters," she said, and the words hung there, simple, undeniable, and for a long moment, no one spoke, because there was nothing to add, nothing to take away, and the lead rider finally moved, not forward, not back, but enough to dismount, his boots touching the ground with a sound that seemed louder in the silence, and he stepped a few paces closer, stopping at a respectful distance from Nayeli and Ethan. And he looked at Ethan directly now, his gaze steady, measured, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm weight as before. "Then we see him," he said, and the meaning of that settled deeper than any gesture, because it was not a reward, not a declaration, it was recognition, and Ethan felt it in a way he had not expected, a quiet acknowledgement that did not demand anything in return, and the town stood witness to that too. The shift from judgment to something else, something they did not yet have a name for, and the wind moved again, softer now, carrying the last traces of heat across the street, and Ethan stood there between them, no longer just a man who had spoken out of turn, but someone who had stepped into a moment and stayed, and that, more than anything else, was what remained when everything else had fallen silent. The words settled deeper than the dust ever could. "Then we see him," and for a long moment nothing moved, not the riders, not the town, not even the wind that had carried this day from one breath to the next, and Ethan stood there feeling the weight of that recognition without knowing what to do with it, because it did not ask for anything, did not demand a response, it simply existed, and that made it heavier than any expectation the town had ever placed on him, and he shifted his gaze slightly, not away, just enough to take in the space around him. The faces that had once looked past him now watching with something quieter, something uncertain, and he realized that being seen was not the same as being understood, and that difference settled into him slowly, like a lesson he had spent years avoiding, and the lead rider remained where he stood, his presence steady, his eyes still on Ethan, not pressing, not measuring, simply acknowledging, and that acknowledgement carried a kind of respect that did not belong to the town, did not belong to the rules Ethan had learned to live by, and it stirred something in him he had not felt in a long time, something close to belonging, though he did not name it that, not yet, and Nayeli stood between them, not as a barrier, not as a bridge, but as something more grounded, something that did not need to connect them to exist fully, and she turned her head slightly toward Ethan again, her gaze softer now, not cautious, not distant, but than anything she had said before, because it named what mattered without dressing it in anything else. And Ethan let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding, and for the first time since this began, he allowed himself to answer not as a man standing against a crowd, but as himself. "I could not walk away," he said, and the words were not dramatic, not shaped for effect. They were plain, honest, and that honesty settled between them in a way that needed no further explanation, and Nayeli held his gaze for a second longer, and something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that it changed the air around them, and she nodded once, a small movement that carried acceptance, not of him, not entirely, but of the moment they now shared, and behind them, the town remained still, but the stillness had changed. It was no longer tense, no longer waiting for something to break. It was quieter, heavier, like a field after a long storm when the sky has cleared, but the ground still remembers the rain. And the sheriff took a step back then, not out of defeat, not out of surrender, but out of understanding, creating space where before he had tried to hold it. And that single step spoke louder than any command he had given that day, because it acknowledged that the moment no longer belonged to him. And the lead rider watched that too, the way the man of the town had shifted without being forced. And he inclined his head slightly in recognition, not to the sheriff alone, but to the choice that had just been made. And then he turned his gaze back to Nayeli, and his voice came again, steady, quiet. "You will come with us," he said, and it was not a command, not a demand. It was an offering of return, and the town felt that difference even if they could not explain it. And Nayeli did not answer right away. She let the words settle, let the meaning unfold fully before she responded. And then she spoke, her voice calm, certain. "I will," she said, and the simplicity of it closed something that had been open since the beginning. And Ethan felt that closure too, felt the shape of the moment shifting toward its end, and something inside him tightened again. Not regret, not exactly, but the quiet awareness that the path he had stepped onto was about to split again, and that this time, there would be no crowd, no voices, no dust to guide him. Only the choice of where he stood when the moment passed, and Naeli turned to him fully then, no distance left between their gaze, and for a second, the world around them seemed to fall away, the town, the riders, the heat, all of it fading into something quieter, and she studied him in that stillness, as if weighing something that could not be measured in words. And then she spoke, her voice just above a whisper. "You do not belong to this place," she said, and it was not an insult, not a judgment. It was a truth, plain and steady, and Ethan felt it land without resistance, because he had known it long before she said it, had carried it with him across miles of empty land and silent nights, and he gave the smallest nod in return, not denying it, not questioning it, just accepting it as it was, and Naeli held his gaze for one more moment before continuing. "But you stood here anyway," she said, and that was where the weight shifted, where the truth changed shape, and Ethan felt that too, the difference between belonging and choosing, and he did not answer this time, because there was nothing to add, nothing to explain, only the quiet understanding that had grown between them, and the lead rider stepped back then, turning slightly toward his horse, the others behind him beginning to move. In the same quiet, deliberate way they had arrived, and the town watched as the line of riders prepared to leave, not in haste, not in retreat, but in completion, and the sheriff remained where he was, no longer trying to hold the moment, simply witnessing its end, and Ethan stood in the center of it all, feeling the weight of what had passed settle into something that would not fade with the day. And as Naeli turned to follow the riders, she paused for just a second, just long enough to glance back at him, and in that glance was something unspoken, something that did not ask, did not promise, but remained, and then she stepped forward, and the moment moved with her, leaving the town, quieter than it had ever been, and leaving Ethan Cole standing in the dust, not the same man who had stepped forward hours ago, but someone who had stayed long enough to be seen, and to see in return. Did not feel like loss. It felt like something else, something that had been formed rather than taken, and Ethan felt it settle into him, not as regret, but as understanding, the kind that does not ask for more than it is given, and she held that look for a second longer before turning forward again, aligning herself with the riders as they began to move, and the line shifted into motion, slow at first, then steadier, their figures blending into the landscape as they made their way back toward the open land, and the town watched them go, not with relief, not with fear, but with a stillness that carried something new, something that would not leave when the last rider disappeared over the horizon, and Ethan stood where he was, the sun still high above him, the heat still pressing down, but the weight of the day had changed, it no longer pressed against him, it rested within him, and he exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a way that felt different from before, as if something inside him had shifted into place, and behind him, the rope remained in the dust, untouched, a quiet reminder of what had begun this moment and how far it had traveled. And the sheriff finally turned his head toward Ethan, not sharply, not with authority, but with something closer to acknowledgement, and he stepped forward just enough to close part of the space between them. "You made your choice," he said, and the words were not heavy, not accusing, just stated, and Ethan nodded once, not because he needed to confirm it, but because there was nothing else to say, and the sheriff held his gaze for a moment longer before adding, "And it changed things," and that was the closest he came to admitting what everyone there already knew, and Ethan did not answer, because he understood that too, understood that change did not always announce itself, did not always come with clear edges or final words. It simply settled into the ground and remained, and the townspeople began to move then. Slowly at first, small shifts, a step back, a turn of the head, the quiet return of motion to a place that had been held still, and the street began to fill again with the ordinary sounds of boots and breath and low voices, but none of it felt the same, not entirely, because something had been seen, Something had been allowed to stand where before it would have been pushed aside, and Ethan turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the riders had gone, and for a brief second, he considered the path that lay beyond the town, the open land, the unknown distance, but he did not move, not yet, because the moment had not fully released him, not until he understood what remained, and the wind moved again, softer now, carrying the last traces of dust away, leaving the street clearer than it had been that morning, and Ethan Cole stood there, no longer at the edge, no longer unseen, but not fully belonging either, somewhere in between, and for the first time, that space did not feel empty. It felt like something he could stand within without needing to leave it behind. The street did not return to what it had been, not fully, even as the riders disappeared into the distance, and the last trace of dust settled into the cracks of the earth, because something invisible had shifted, something that could not be swept away with a broom or covered with and Ethan remained where he stood for a long moment after the others had begun to move, his eyes still resting on the horizon, as if the shape of that moment had not yet finished unfolding, and behind him the low murmur of voices returned, but softer now, careful, as if each word had to pass through a new understanding before it could be spoken, and the sheriff lingered nearby, not watching the horizon anymore, but watching the people, measuring the change not in distance, but in how they held themselves. And Ethan finally shifted his weight, the simple act grounding him back into the place he stood, the heat pressing down again, the smell of dry wood and dust rising around him, familiar and unchanged. And yet it did not feel the same, not after what had passed, and he turned slightly, his gaze moving across the street, across the men who now avoided meeting his eyes directly, not out of hostility, not anymore, but out of something closer to thought, and that was new. And the rope still lay where it had fallen, half buried now under a thin layer of dust, its purpose gone, but its presence still speaking, and Ethan stepped toward it without thinking, slow, deliberate, and when he bent to pick it up, the fibers felt rough against his fingers, real, solid, and for a second he simply held it there, not as a reminder of what had been done, but of what had been allowed to happen. And then he coiled it loosely and set it on the post where Naeli had stood, not tying it, not securing it, just placing it there, like something that no longer needed to hold anything in place. And when he straightened, the sheriff had moved closer, his boots quiet on the dirt, his presence no longer carrying the weight of command, but something steadier, something more grounded. And he stopped a few feet away, not invading, not distant, just present. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because the need for immediate words had passed. And when the sheriff finally did, his voice was low, almost reflective. I have seen a lot of things in this town, he said, but not that. And there was no judgment in it, no attempt to define what had happened, just an admission that something had gone beyond what he understood, and Ethan gave a small nod, not agreeing, not correcting, just acknowledging the truth of it, and the sheriff studied him for another second before continuing. You could have walked away, he said, and this time there was something more in his tone, not a question, but a recognition of the choice itself, and Ethan glanced toward the horizon again, then back to the street, and he answered simply, so could everyone else. And the words settled differently, because they did not place the moment on one man alone. They spread it across the space where everyone had stood, and the sheriff exhaled quietly, as if that truth had been there all along, waiting to be named, and behind them the town continued its slow return to movement, doors opening, voices rising again in cautious conversation. But nothing carried the same edge it had before, and Ethan turned then, not toward the saloon, not toward the stables, but toward the open stretch of street that led out past the last building, his steps, unhurried, not driven by urgency, but by something quieter, something that had settled into him without asking. And as he walked, the sun cast a long shadow at his feet, stretching out ahead of him like a path that did not yet have a name. And he paused once near the edge of town, just before the dirt road gave way to open land, and he looked back, not searching, not expecting, just taking in the place as it now stood, the buildings, the people, the space that had held the moment, and he saw it differently, not as something to leave behind, but as something that had revealed itself, and that mattered, even if he did not stay. And the sheriff stood further back, watching him go, not calling out, not stopping him, just witnessing in the same quiet way the riders had, and Ethan gave the slightest nod in return, a gesture small enough to pass unnoticed by most, but enough to mark the space between them as something changed, something understood without needing to be spoken, and then he turned forward again, his gaze settling on the horizon where the land opened wide, and he took a step, then another, his boots carrying him away from the street, from the dust, from the place where everything had shifted, but not away from what he had become within it, and the wind moved gently across the open ground, lifting the edge of his coat, carrying with it the faint echo of voices that had quieted not from fear, but from something deeper, something that would remain long after the day had ended, and Ethan Cole walked on, not chasing, not fleeing, just moving forward, carrying with him the weight of a moment that had asked nothing and changed everything. And behind him the town stood under the same sun, the same sky, but no longer quite the same as it had been before. The road stretched ahead in a long, quiet line, the kind that did not promise anything but distance, and Ethan followed it without hurry, his steps steady, his shadow moving beside him like it had always been there. And for a while, the town remained behind him without sound, without presence, just a place that had existed and now no longer held him, and the wind moved across the open land, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and sun-warmed earth, and it felt different out here, not lighter, not easier, but clearer, as if the air itself did not need to explain anything, and Ethan walked on, not looking back again, not because he refused to, but because there was nothing left behind that needed his eyes, only something carried forward that he had not yet fully understood, and the horizon held steady in front of him, wide and unbroken, and for a long stretch, the only sound was the rhythm of his boots against the ground, measured, even, a quiet reminder that movement itself could be enough. And then he heard it, faint at first, the soft echo of hooves somewhere beyond sight, not behind him, not chasing, but ahead, off to the side where the land dipped slightly before rising again, and he slowed without thinking, his gaze shifting toward the sound, and there, just at the edge of distance, he saw a shape, a rider standing still against the light, waiting without signal, without urgency, and Ethan stopped, not out of caution, not out of doubt, but because the moment asked for stillness again, the same kind that had held him in the center of the town, and the rider did not move closer, did not call out, just remained there, a quiet presence against the wide sky, and Ethan took a step forward, then another, closing the distance slowly, the space between them shrinking not in tension, but in understanding. And as he drew near, the figure became clear. Nayeli sat atop her horse, her posture straight, her gaze already on him, as if she had known exactly where he would be and when, and there was no surprise in her eyes, no hesitation, only that same steady clarity he had seen before, and he stopped a few feet away, the distance between them small enough for words, but neither of them spoke right away, because the silence itself held meaning, and the wind moved lightly between them, lifting the edge of her hair, brushing against his coat, and finally she spoke, her voice calm, unhurried. "You walk like a man who does not know where he belongs," she said, and the words did not carry judgment, only observation, and Ethan let out a quiet breath, his gaze steady on hers. "Maybe I never did," he answered, and the honesty in it did not weigh him down the way it once might have. It simply existed, like the land around them, and Nayeli studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slightly, as if confirming something she had already seen, and she turned her head just enough to glance toward the horizon behind her, the direction the riders had gone, and then back to him. "You stood where it mattered," she said, and this time, the words carried something more, something that reached beyond the moment they had shared, and Ethan felt it settle into him again. That quiet recognition that did not ask for anything more than presence, and he did not respond with words, because there was nothing to add, only the understanding that had already taken root, and Nayeli shifted slightly in the saddle, not preparing to leave, not staying either, just adjusting to the moment as it was. And then she reached into the small pouch at her side and drew out a thin leather cord, simple, worn, with a small carved bead threaded at its center, and she held it out to him, not as a gift, not as a reward, but as something that belonged in the space between them, and Ethan looked at it, then at her, And for a second, he hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of the awareness that accepting it would mean carrying something he did not yet fully understand. And she seemed to read that hesitation, because she spoke again, softer now. "It is not for what you did," she said. "It is for what you did not turn away from." And the words settled deeper than the object itself, because they named something he had not been able to. And Ethan reached out then, taking the cord in his hand, the leather warm from where she had held it. And as his fingers closed around it, something in him shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that could be seen, but in a way that would remain. And Nayeli released it without holding on, without marking the moment as anything more than it was. And she gave a small nod, the kind that did not ask for acknowledgement in return. And then she turned her horse slightly, angling back toward the open land. And for a brief second, she looked over her shoulder at him again, her expression unchanged, but her eyes carrying something unspoken, something that did not belong to either of them alone. And then she spoke one last time, her voice carried lightly by the wind. "Out here, you do not need a place to belong," she said. "Only a place you are willing to stand." And then she turned forward fully, guiding her horse into motion, and the distance between them began to grow again. Not sharply, not suddenly, but in the same steady way it had closed. And Ethan stood there watching her go, the leather cord resting in his hand, the bead catching the light just enough to remind him it was real. And he did not call after her, did not follow, because the moment did not ask for that. It asked only that he remain where he was, long enough to understand what he now carried. And as she disappeared into the horizon, blending into the land the same way the riders had, Ethan looked down at the cord in his hand, then slowly lifted his gaze back to the open road ahead. And after a moment, he slipped the cord into his pocket, not as something to show, not as something to explain, but as something to keep. And he took a step forward, then another, his boots finding the same steady rhythm as before. But this time, it felt different, not because the road had changed, but because he had. And the wind moved gently across the land, carrying no voices, no expectations, only the quiet understanding that some choices do not end when the moment passes. They continue, step by step, into whatever comes next. And Ethan Cole walked on, not searching, not lost, just moving forward, knowing now that out here, that was enough.